There is a people who should not exist. Not in the sense that their existence is impossible, but in the sense that everything we understand about how Europe was built predicts that they would have been absorbed, overwritten, erased. Folded into the larger story the way every other pre-modern population on the continent eventually was. They were not. The Basques live today in a compact mountainous region straddling the Western Pyrenees, on both sides of what is now the border between Spain and France. Roughly 3 million people. A distinct culture, a distinct history, a distinct set of traditions reaching back further than most European nations can honestly claim, and a language, Euskara, that belongs to no known language family on earth, not Indo-European, not Semitic. Not related to any tongues spoken by any neighboring people or any distant cousin population that linguists have yet identified. It is, in the most literal technical sense, a language isolate, a linguistic island with no visible mainland. For generations, this combination of geographic persistence and linguistic uniqueness generated theories. The Basques, some argued, were the original Europeans, survivors of a continent-wide population that existed before the great migrations of the Neolithic and Bronze Ages swept across Europe and replaced whoever had been there before. Others suggested they were remnants of a lost civilization, Atlantis appearing in various guises in the more imaginative versions of the story. Others pointed simply to the mountains, arguing that the Pyrenees had acted as a natural barrier, shielding a small population from the demographic waves that reshaped the rest of the continent. 19th-century anthropologists measured Basque skulls and declared them a distinct racial type. Early 20th-century linguists proposed connections to Caucasian languages, to ancient Iberian, to proto-languages spoken before the last ice age. None of these theories held up under scrutiny. Each one eventually collapsed when the evidence was examined closely enough. And yet the underlying intuition that drove them all, that the Basques were genuinely, measurably, profoundly different from the populations around them, turned out to be correct. These theories shared a common shape. They all assumed the Basques were old. Older than their neighbors, older than the Indo-European world that surrounded them. They just disagreed about exactly what kind of old. The genetics, when they finally arrived, confirmed something extraordinary. The theories were right about the age. They were not quite right about the mechanism. And in the gap between those two things lies a story about human survival that no one had fully anticipated. The first serious genetic studies of Basque populations in the 1990s and early 2000s used mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers to compare Basques against neighboring Iberian and French populations. The results were striking from the beginning. The Basques showed genetic signatures that diverged from surrounding European populations in ways that were statistically significant and consistent across multiple markers. They were not simply a regional variant of Spanish or French ancestry. They were something measurably different. At first, this seemed to confirm the isolation hypothesis. The Pyrenees had kept them apart. The gene pool had drifted in its own direction over centuries of relative separation. But the degree of divergence was larger than simple geographic isolation could fully account for, and the specific character of the divergence was pointing at something deeper than a few centuries of mountain living. The real transformation in understanding came with ancient DNA. Beginning around 2015 and accelerating rapidly through the end of that decade and into the 2020s, researchers began extracting and sequencing genomes from prehistoric burials across Europe with a precision that had simply not been possible before. The picture that emerged from that work rewrote the population history of an entire continent. Europe, it turned out, had been settled not once, but at least 3 times by genetically distinct populations. The first were the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the people who had lived across the continent during and after the last ice age, whose ancestry traces back to populations that entered Europe from the east somewhere between 40,000 and 45,000 years ago. They were, by the standards of later European populations, a relatively uniform group across the continent, lean-faced, likely dark-skinned and dark-eyed based on the genetic variants associated with those traits, and living in small mobile communities that followed large game animals across a landscape that would be unrecognizable today. The second wave came with the Neolithic, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, when farmers from Anatolia, what is today Turkey, began moving westward into Europe, bringing with them wheat, cattle, sheep, and a package of agricultural technologies that allowed population densities an order of magnitude higher than anything the hunter-gatherers had sustained. These Anatolian farmers spread across the continent with remarkable speed, and wherever they went, the genetic signature of the earlier hunter-gatherers was compressed and diluted. Not eliminated, but reduced to a smaller proportion of the overall ancestry of European populations. The third wave arrived around 5,000 years ago, when pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, pushed westward into Europe on horseback, carrying with them the ancestral forms of virtually all Indo-European languages spoken across the continent today. This steppe migration was massive, and its genetic impact was enormous. Across most of northern and central Europe, steppe ancestry came to account for 50% or more of the total genetic ancestry of local populations within just a few generations. The languages, the burial customs, the religious frameworks of pre-steppe Europe were largely replaced. This is the genetic history of the continent. 3 waves, each one transforming what came before. Each one leaving the previous population as a reduced and diluted component of whatever emerged from the mixture. And here is where the Basques become genuinely astonishing. When researchers analyzed ancient DNA from Basque region burials, spanning the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, they found that the Basque population had absorbed the first 2 waves, the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and the Anatolian farmers, in proportions broadly similar to other European populations. But the third wave, the steppe migration that remade the genetics and the language of virtually every other population in Western Europe, had passed through the Basque country at dramatically reduced intensity. The steppe ancestry component that accounts for roughly half the genetic heritage of most Northern Europeans, and for substantial fractions, even in Southern European populations, is present in Basques at levels significantly lower than in any surrounding group. What this means in plain language is this: the language isolate and the genetic signal point at the same thing. When the Indo-European speaking steppe pastoralists moved across Europe 5,000 years ago, they did not penetrate the Basque region with the same force they brought everywhere else. Some admixture occurred. The Basques are not genetically frozen in the Neolithic, but the steppe component that arrived with the Indo-European languages and replaced the pre-existing linguistic landscape almost everywhere else left the Basque region only partially transformed. The mountains mattered, but not simply as a geographic barrier. What the mountains appear to have done is slow the demographic replacement enough that the pre-existing population retained sufficient density and social coherence to resist full absorption. Enough people survived the transition, in enough concentration, to keep speaking the language that had no Indo-European replacement. Enough mothers passed Euskara to their children across enough generations that the steppe migration became an addition to the Basque genome rather than a replacement of it. The genetics and the language survived together because enough people survived together. This is the twist that changes everything. The Basques are not survivors of some mythological lost civilization. They are not the remnant of Atlantis, or the keepers of a pre-human knowledge tradition, or anything that the more romantic theories proposed. They are something simultaneously more ordinary and more remarkable. They are the people the Bronze Age didn't fully reach, in a continent where the steppe migration was one of the most transformative demographic events in human prehistory, reshaping the ancestry and the language of populations from Ireland to India. The Basques are the clearest surviving evidence of what was there before. Their language is not a mystery without an explanation. It is the explanation. It is what European languages sounded like before the Indo-Europeans arrived. Not specifically, not in its current form, which has obviously evolved across thousands of years, but structurally, grammatically, in the deep architecture of how the language organizes thought. Euskara is a window into a linguistic world that everywhere else was extinguished so completely that we have no other record of it. Imagine standing on a ridge in the Western Pyrenees in the early morning, looking north across the Bay of Biscay. The landscape is green and steep and deeply folded, the kind of terrain that makes movement difficult in every direction. Somewhere in the valley below, a language is being spoken that was old before Latin existed, old before Greek existed, old before Sanskrit was carried westward across the Iranian plateau. People are drinking coffee and arguing about football scores and ordering groceries in a tongue that no conqueror ever managed to replace. Not the Romans, who absorbed every other language in Iberia within a few generations. Not the Visigoths. Not the Moors. Not the Castilians. There is something in that fact that resists simple summary. The Basques did not survive because they were stronger than the forces that reshaped Europe. They survived because the terrain bought them enough time, and enough density, and enough continuity that the transmission of identity from parent to child never fully broke. DNA does not lie about this. The genetic record is unambiguous. The Basques carry in their genomes the clearest surviving signal of pre-Indo-European Europe. A biological archive of a world that existed across this entire continent before the steppe migrations remade it, and that has been invisible everywhere else for 5,000 years. That archive is not a relic. It is a living population of 3 million people who wake up every morning in the same mountains where their ancestors waited out the Bronze Age and speak to their children, a language that the rest of Europe forgot it ever knew.